So we've had a bit of time to stew on the latest season of Stranger Things, and with no release date on the horizon for the time being, I thought today would be a good time to talk about one of the biggest points of contention for the fandom coming out of the latest season. And that is, of course, character deaths. Are they necessary? Does killing off your heroes make for compelling TV? Or have we been brainwashed by Game of Thrones into thinking this is the best way forward? The best way to write your story? That the only way for a story to be emotional and have stakes is to kill off fan favourite characters unexpectedly. And in all fairness, it has been a bit of a pattern in the series overall. In season 1 we saw Barb, who was guilty of the crime of trying to be a good friend to Nancy, bite the bullet. In season 2, we saw Bob die after he had this huge heroic arc where he saves the day, only to get slaughtered by demidogs after the fact. Season 3 saw the death of Alexei, the Russian scientist who got whacked by the Russian Terminator guy, just as he was starting to enjoy life in America, and Billy, who died trying to save Eleven from the Mind Flayer. And then of course, season 4 had a bunch of other deaths, but most crucially, we saw the death of newcomer Eddie Munson, the leader of the Hellfire Club, a group of D&D players that the party had joined off screen. And he dies trying to ensure that the rest of the team survive during the fight against Vecna. So already, that's a lot of deaths for 4 seasons. And they're not just low tier characters either. These deaths were all important and they served the plot in one way or another. And most of them had a lot of emotional build up. And they made you feel sad, and in turn, they stimulated the development of new storylines. But of course, the show has not managed to escape criticism in this regard as well, because on one hand, people just seem to want more deaths, or at least a vocal portion of the fandom does. They're suckers for punishment, it seems. They want a clean house with a bunch of different characters, whilst at the same time not wanting these deaths to be limited to secondary or tertiary characters. Because there's less of an effect, because we get to know these characters a little better and we start to care about them, and then wham, they're killed off just to up the emotional stakes with minimal risk to the overall story. But meanwhile, our main character's being kept out of the firing line. They might get injured or whatever, but they always pull through, and in the end, they avoid death and continue on to the next season. And as each season's gone along, I feel like there has been a bit of bubbling discontent. And so now, people for this final season seemingly want to see at least one of these main characters die. Just cause, I guess. Maybe to up the stakes of the story and make Vecna seem like a much more credible threat to the party. And I mean, you could debate back and forth as to whether Stranger Things actually needs to have key character deaths for its final chapter, but before I really talk about anything like that, I want to work my way through the characters we have left. Or at least the major characters. Characters that would have any emotional or narrative relevance tied to their demise, and really determine whether it's likely that we may be saying a more permanent farewell. And so with all that being said, let's get into it. So I guess we better start with the big names. The party. The iconic characters of the franchise. That's Mike, Will, Dustin, Lucas, Max, and Eleven. We saw them start out as fresh-faced youngsters, and now, despite the show saying that they're not adults, we've arrived at 20-year-olds playing 14-year-olds, hooray! And they've been the emotional core of the franchise. And whilst there's been some near misses, they have all managed to survive thus far, and honestly, I don't see that changing. I can't see a show that leans so heavily on 80s tropes and archetypes killing off your child characters in the middle of their coming-of-age arcs. I feel like the closest call we're ever going to get to that is Max. But to me, that feels sort of like their own Han Solo in Carbonite moment. The point of the story where it feels the darkest, the most bleak, but she's going to come back from it. And so this final season is going to be like the Return of the Jedi. They're going to be overcoming Vecna, and the core group, the party, is going to remain alive until the very end. I feel like having one of them die means that there's no happy ending. Every season the ending is bittersweet. Losing Eleven, Joyce missing Bob, Hopper's fake death, and now what happened to Hawkins and to Max, and that's fine, because there's always that glimmer of hope at the end that it's going to improve next season, and we can be happy. But if you finish on that bittersweet note by killing off a child, I don't think it fits the feel of the show in general. Whilst there's always going to be bittersweet elements in the finale, any death of a member of the party is going to up the bitter and cut the sweet. And so from a writing perspective, I just don't see them making that choice. Similarly, that's the reason I doubt we're going to farewell Joyce either. They've been building this goddamn romance with Hopper for years now. Could you imagine if they killed her off just as the storyline's hitting its stride? I mean, yeah, it's tragic, but it's also a dick tease after what would have been 10 years of storyline almost. It would breed dissatisfaction overall to screw them over right at the end, and it would just be a terrible way to leave off the story. And yeah, the same principle applies to Hopper, but even worse, since they've already done a death fake out for him in the past. And thus, we've seen the emotional aftermath of what would happen if his character died. And that one was done fairly well. There's no point in trying to live up to that. It would just feel pointless. And so, Hopper and Joyce? No. And so this takes us to characters like Nancy and Jonathan, Steve and Robin, the ones that seem like they're always in danger when it comes down to crunch time. Especially Steve, poor dude takes a beating every season. For Robin, I just don't see it happening. Doesn't strike me as the type of character that's going to get killed off, especially since they haven't really devoted all that much time to fleshing out her character much at all, beyond being Steve's quirky friend who helps out. I mean, she just hasn't carved out that identity too much just yet, so I don't think her death would have the right impact. Plus, killing off your major LGBT character just seems like a bad look, honestly. I mean, nothing would really surprise me with Hollywood, but I just can't see that being an option. So it just really whittles us down to Nancy, Steve, and Jonathan, who are all in the midst of their own little love triangle storyline, and I feel like Jonathan, at the very minimum, really can't be a character who dies if you don't want that bitterness to override the sweetness. If that's the sort of ending you're going for. And surely that's the sort of ending they don't want to have, something that's way too sad. Remember, Will going missing drove Joyce to her breaking point. One of her sons straight up dying feels like it would be game over for her mental health forever, so everyone's just going to have a sad ending. And I mean, nobody wants to see that, surely. It's not a satisfying conclusion. It feels like this show is building to a happy ending, not a depressing, realistic, bleak ending. And ultimately, it would just overshadow things too much. And it's the same thing with the Nancy death. It would be too overpowering and would leave the love triangle storyline dead in the water. And whilst that does sound nice in theory, after all, I'm not on board with that story. In the end, it's still a shit ending that kills off potential narrative growth. Unless Steve and Jonathan are suddenly in love. But somehow I doubt that is their endgame pairing. So who does that leave us with? Steve, I suppose, but I feel like they've already done this kind of thing over and over again. Remember when he got mauled in the Upside Down last season? Would they rehash that? Would it be worth it? Whilst I feel like he is the character of all characters that could be killed off, and is the one that would make the most sense, in the end, I think it's almost better if they don't. Because can anything really top the emotion of what happened to Max in the final episode? Should they even bother trying? Honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think that the time for dead characters, or at least dead protagonists, is largely past. I don't think that every story needs to have that bittersweet moment. The death of characters should serve a purpose beyond just shock. It should contribute to the story, to the narrative. But if they killed off Steve, I feel like it's just there to tie up a loose end, so that Nancy has the obvious choice of Jonathan. But beyond that, his death wouldn't serve much of a purpose. I mean, I guess it could break Dustin's heart, but we've already done that with Eddie's death. And yeah, I guess it could up the stakes, but we already know the stakes. The whole Max thing was the perfect way of getting across how monstrous and dangerous Vecna really is. And in the end, I think they want the show to end on a warmer note. It just feels right when you look at the franchise overall to have a happy ending. All these characters have waded through so much shit, and so you want them to finish off on a high note. You don't want them standing by yet another coffin, mourning yet another friend. That'd just be a bummer. And so, yeah, don't really have all that much to say beyond that. So I will just remind you that these have just been my opinions, and I'd like to hear yours. Do you think that any of the characters should be killed off in the upcoming season of Stranger Things? If so, which ones and why? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.